many of you have seen this photograph before, but I'll call you again. This kitchen, done in solid cherry, the door which leads through to the scullery, also done in solid cherry, had about 70 or 80 doors. The rest of the house, another 50, so I think I have just a little bit of credibility when I stand up and talk about doors. Actually, I've made a lot of doors in my woodworking career, and as I went through the material and prepared tonight's presentation, I realized I've in fact got enough for a half day or maybe even a full day workshop. So I'm not going to give you all the answers tonight, but what I am going to give you is all the questions. All the questions you must ask yourself before you start, as you design and start thinking about constructing a cabinet. And I guess it's more important to know the questions, because you can always find the answers somehow, somewhere. Now, my late mother used to tell my brother and I that manners maketh the man. I'd like to paraphrase my mother and say, doors maketh the cabinet. I think the door is the focal point of a cabinet. It's the thing which first catches your eye. And before you start, there are some very fundamental decisions you have to make. Are you going to use a slab door, which I define as a door made out of a single piece of wood, normally a man-made board, MDF or chipboard, or are you going to build up that door out of multiple pieces? And the simplest built-up door consists of at least 5 pieces. Many doors have a lot more pieces. So, slab, flat slab, or fancier built-up door. One of the first decisions you have to make. The next decision you have to make is, am I going to make an inset door or an overlay door? An inset door fits inside a frame and has to be built, or at least trimmed, to very close tolerances. Not too close, because then the door won't open in the wet season. Or are you going to make an overlay door which lays on top of the frame and is nowhere near as demanding, but can often spoil the appearance of a front of the cabinet because you've got this door obviously plopped on afterwards, sticking out. Another fundamental decision you have to make is, am I going to hinge the door, or is it going to slide? Or in fact, is it going to be some combination of hinge and slide? A bifold door. Now, I don't like sliding doors. I don't like sliding doors because this picture, which I took out of fine woodworking, it's very obvious that the one door is behind the other, and just the front of the piece of furniture just looks wrong because there's a difference in plane. However, I must admit that there are occasions where you are short of space to open a door, and a sliding door is an ideal answer. So you need to make some of these fundamental decisions before you even start. And make those decisions before you start. Now, let's talk very quickly about slab doors, because I want to spend most of the time this evening talking about built-up doors. And let's talk about slab doors made out of medium density fiber. MDF is an ideal material for this type of job. It's stable, which is important for a door. It's flat, and if you treat the edges properly, it paints very well. But flat painted panels can be boring. You know, a single cupboard with a single wall chest, medicine chest with a flat painted door is okay, but flat door after flat door after flat door becomes very, very boring, and you probably need to tart these doors up somehow. MDF, another attribute of MDF is MDF routes extremely well on both its face and its edge. And here's a sample of a simple door which I'll pass around, routed with a 500 Rand quarter-inch Bosch router. In fact, that door was the subject of an article I wrote for the Home Handyman magazine. So, if you have a small router and you're interested in making doors like this, you see if you can get hold of that back issue. In fact, commercially, a lot of MDF doors are CNC routed along the lines of this door. Flat painted panels can be boring. Another solution is to add some sort of molding as an overlay. And this is an example of the built-in cupboard I made for my daughter, who is now 40 years old. A simple overlay, a bit of simple picture framing stuck on. No more nails was available in those days, but that's what I would use today. So you could write a pattern in it, you could put an overlay in it, or in fact you can overlay the edge. And here's another example of a plain, flat, painted door, just made a little more interesting by applying a molding, almost a very simple frame around its edge. Enough about MDF. Let's move on to veneered MDF or veneered chipboard. Again, very flat, very stable. And the beauty of using a veneered material is you can get excellent pattern matching by cutting this door and that door which goes next to it, the door which goes next to it, out of the same board next to each other, or the door and the door on top of it, or by cutting from adjacent doors. So if you get these large 9x6 panels, whatever that is in metric, of a veneered board, you can get some very interesting matching effects of the figure of the veneer, which is very hard to achieve using solid wood. But there's a problem. There's a problem with veneered MDF, veneered chipboard. And just to make sure you're all awake, what is the problem?
Well, here my way. You can't wrap your good.
You're not looking to do that because you have the figure of the veneer to relieve the flatness. All of these things are problems. And yes, if you make skirting out of chipboard and it gets wet, it's a problem. If you make bathroom cupboards, it's a problem. The real problem, I think the real problem with chipboard is it's got very ugly edges. And if you're going to cut door slabs out of a sheet of chipboard, you have to do something about those edges. Now, Timber City will edge. They will actually cut and edge them for you. Price ranging anywhere from £3 to £40, depending on the material. But there's a lot more satisfaction in edging your own doors. You know, doing it yourself, because isn't that what we're all about? Don't put iron-on veneer unless you're making doors for cupboards in your garage. Iron-on veneer is nowhere near robust enough, and it's going to, on a door in particular, the top corner is going to chip in no time flat. I put a solid edging on my veneered doors, varying in size from 3mm to 16mm, depending on the effect I like to achieve. Now, as somebody pointed out, today's veneers are very, very thin, well under a millimeter, 0.3, 0.4 of a millimeter, very, very thin. And if you apply an edge, like this edge is applied to a veneered chipboard, you can't glue it up perfectly flat. You've got to make your edge slightly oversized and let it hang over. And the question is, how do you trim it? And again, these two red X's tell you here, don't try to trim it with the belt sander. You're going to go through the veneer in no time flat, just the slightest slip. In fact, don't even try and trim it with a rotary sander. You're going to go through the veneer. So what do? At our show last year, Greatest had a beautiful trimming plane for doing just this, for taking the edge, solid edging down flush with the veneer. Only trouble is it cost 5,000 rand. I can't afford that sort of money, so I made a simple jig for my, again, 4-inch router, which cost me 50 rand. And here is an example. It's not chipboard, it's plywood, but of a hardwood edging, and that edge was trimmed. That edge was trimmed with a simple rounded jig. And this article which I wrote will be published in the one which is coming out this month. Rob, turn that over. The side you're looking at has had a light sanding. The back side hasn't even been touched with sandpaper, and you can see how well it cuts. And this picture here, you can see a piece of molding, a piece of edging, which is about a millimeter too high, being trimmed right to left. The opposite way, using a time cut, so you don't get chip out on the edge of a piece of it here. And it works, it works well. Just one point about hinging slab doors made out of MDF or made out of chipboard. I will use nothing but a euro or a cup hinge. Where the hinge is set in a drilled hole. It's I figured exactly how far it is from the edge, well in from the edge. Any other type of hinge, I believe the screws are too close to the edge. I also, probably most of the doors I've been asked to come and repair have been ones where the guy just put the hinge in with chipboard screws. That's guaranteed to pull out. Use these plastic dowels, which all of the suppliers of this hardware will sell to you. One more thing on slab doors. Let's talk about making slab doors out of solid wood. And of course, theoretically, you can make a slab door out of a solid piece of wood. But the trouble with a solid piece of wood is it's prone to cupping and twisting. Unlike a tabletop, which is constrained by the aprons and the Z-clips you put underneath, a door is unrestrained. And anything other than a very small door made out of anything but well-seasoned, quarter-sawn material is guaranteed to cut and twist. But choose the material carefully, get some nice quarter-sawn material, use a timber which has low shrinkage expansion coefficients, and yes, you can make a bedside cupboard, George, with a solid Empoyer door. But don't try and do it with a bit of laminated pine shelving. It's going to twist, like that. Okay, enough about slab doors. I just want to finish with this. This picture. This picture I took out of one of the books I had. And this picture shows very well, and I hope you can see it, how by cutting adjacent doors and drawer fronts out of a single sheet of veneered material, the pattern, the matching you could get on the figure. Are there any questions about slab doors before I move on to what is really the main part of my presentation? Right, let's move on and talk about bolt-up doors. The most common bolt-up door is a frame and panel. In fact, frame and panel is a technique which has been around for centuries. And I'm going to talk primarily about frame and panel doors tonight because the approaches are equally applicable to making louvre doors, which is a variation of a frame and panel, except nobody makes louvre doors today. I inherited a whole lot of second-hand louvre doors, and not one second-hand building dealer was even interested in taking them. Hollow core doors, tambour doors. I've never made a tambour door, but I know John Diamond has. And a style of door called edge and brace, which is good if you're making garden sheds. There are a number of ways, a number of styles of built-up doors, but we're going to focus this evening on frame and panel. Now, as I said, frame and panel is a time-honored method. It goes back many, many centuries, a way of solving the inherent problems of movement in large pieces of solid wood. And let's face it, a door is a large piece of solid wood. It's used for doors, it's used for sides of cabinets, it's used for chest lids, it's used for the sides of chests. And the idea behind a frame and panel, be it a door or be it a panel exactly, is that you create a frame made out of straight, rigid, strong pieces of wood, and then into grooves or rebates, you let thinner panels, which are the larger pieces of wood, which are prone to movement, and you set them in grooves, which, as is shown here, have an expansion gap to allow that panel to expand in the wet season and allow it to shrink again without falling out in the dry season. And that's the fundamental approach behind frame and panel construction. You trap the panel in a stiff frame, you make the panel a little thinner. Typically a panel like this would be maybe 15, 16 millimeters thick, and you allow provision for expansion and contraction. Some terminology associated with frame and panel doors. The things at the side that go up and down are called the stiles, and a door has two stiles. The things which go across are called rails, and the door may either have two rails, a top and a bottom rail, or any number of intermediate rails. Rails run horizontally. A built-up door may even have things, additional pieces of framing, because it is still framing, running vertically, and these are called muntins. You may come across the word mullion, which is used interchangeably, but a mullion, strictly speaking, is a piece of vertical frame in a window. But I guess if you've got a door with glass panes in it, then indeed it is a mullion. So a muntin is the most common term. Now, so we've seen the makeup of a frame and panel door, and indeed the makeup of most built-up doors, which are really variations of the frame and panel. Now let's take each of the components and go through them and say, what are the questions I must ask? What are the things I must do so that I get doors which last, not forever, but doors at least that last a couple of generations? And let's look at the bits which make up the frame, the straight pieces, the stiles, the rails, and the muntins. You need to think about the choice of wood. Are you going to use flat sawn, or are you going to use quarter sawn wood? You need to think about the grain direction, and I'll talk about the grain direction and the problems with slope and grain in a few minutes. A frame and panel door has at least 4 joints, and when you start adding intermediate rails and muntins, the number of joints go up. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, what sort of joint am I going to make? And the answer to that depends on your skills, and it depends on the equipment you have available. The time-honored method, of course, is a launched mortise and tenon. But for a number of meetings now, going back, Don, to your presentation of more than a year ago, on a bar stool, a loose tenon today is a very, very adequate, more than adequate, in fact equal to the traditional mortise and tenon answer. But they can be biscuits, they can be dowels. We'll talk about coated stick joints, which you can make if you have a router or a spindle. Do you make the joints at 90 degrees? The rails and stiles have the meat at 90 degrees, or do you make it a 45-degree mitre? So these are the sort of questions you need to ask yourself before you start ripping up pieces of wood and rush into making the door. What do you do to the inner and outer edges of the frame and rail, the frame pieces? Do you leave the outer edge plain and just break it with a piece of sandpaper, or do you put a molding on it? What do you do about the inner edge? Do you leave it plain and just break it with a piece of sandpaper before you varnish it or oil it, or do you put a molding on that edge? And simple things like this can change the whole appearance of the door and thus the appearance of the final project. And it can either look very good if you make the right decisions, or it can stick out like a sore thumb if you make the wrong decisions. And here, for example, is a door which has had a 6 millimeter coat around the outside edge. Here's a door which has nothing more than a 1 millimeter chamfer on the inner and outer edges. Why do I say chamfer and not bevel? Let's use a weight here. Don, why do I say chamfer and not bevel?
You just woke me up.
Well, that's exactly why.
A chamfer is done with a chamfering with a chisel.
No.
And a bevel with a plane.
You
And a
certainly
bevel,
can do it.
A chamfer is equal both sides.
No. A bevel is the entire edge of the piece of wood. So when you make up an octagonal pot for a pot stand, those are bevels. Bevels are an angle cut across the full width of the piece, thickness of the piece of wood. A chamfer is a small cut on just the edge. Believe me.
I think a 6 or 1 half it doesn't really
No, Don, there's a major difference between a chamfer and a bevel. Right, let's move on to the panel. What do you use for the panel? Plywood is an adequate answer, and I'll talk more about using plywood for the panels. Do you use solid wood? If you use solid wood, you make the panel flat. Do you raise it? What grain orientation do you look for? Do you look to make your panels out of flat sawn or out of quarter sawn? Do you think of making the panel a contrasting species to the rails? So you put a yellow wood panel inside a black wood frame. Do you do a little bit of carving on it? Do you do a little bit of inlay on it? Do you use a lattice? And a lattice door is an ideal solution where you want the air to get into the cupboard, like for example a grocery cupboard door. You got to ask yourself these questions. What other materials can you use as panels? You can use glass, and there's a little cabinet I made for my accountant to store the list of registered officers. That's sandblasted glass. It can be sandblasted, it can be etched, it can be one of many variations of coloured and figured glass that are available from your glass supplier. It can be made up from leaded glass, and Chris Fenter, we'll mention you again later. Chris is an expert in doing this stained glass work. This one down at the bottom, those are the doors in my study. When I built my house, I seriously ran out of money. The unit in the study was made out of reclaimed sapele, sliced down to 3mm thick and laminated on top of pine so that I had enough to go around. And the only material I could afford for the panels were pieces of cork. And it turned out quite well. I'm not saying you must use cork, but what I'm saying to you is think beyond a solid raised panel. Okay? I see too much furniture, I have nothing against, but I just see too much of it all come off the same, what appear to me to be the same set of cutter knives. You need to think about the hardware. How are you going to hinge it? Are you going to put in the Euro hinge? Are you going to use a butt hinge? Are you going to use a piano hinge? Are you going to use a knife hinge? Are you going to use a barrel hinge? Are you going to use a cabinet hinge? What hinges are you going to use? And how does the door and the hinge relate to the cabinet to which that door is going to be fitted? And if it's an inset door versus an overlaid door, it's probably a different decision you have to make about the hinges. How do you open this door? Are you going to put handles on it? Are you going to put knobs on it? Are you going to route some sort of integral finger hole into the side of the door? What material are you going to use? Plastic, yes. Glass, ceramic, plated brass, solid brass, brushed steel. Are you going to make your own pulls out of an exotic wood, a bit of ebony, a bit of rosewood? And if you remember the sort of things that Butch was showing you, it's little things like this, a handmade rosewood handle, which puts your signature onto that piece of cabinet woodwork, as opposed to a set of solid glass knobs bought from wholesale, bought from wholesale, bought from wholesale. You buy them, you make them, where do you position them? And people have often said to me, Dennis, what is the rule? Where must the knob go? Must it go a third of the way down? There is no rule. I make doors with the knobs in the middle. I make doors where the knob is right at the top. Where does the handle go? Does it go this way or does it go that way? Does it go on the frame, on the style? Does it go on the rail? Does it go in the middle of the panel? There are no rules. And you know, think about it. You can make a cabinet that is different, that has your personal signature on it, just with some attention to where and how you place the pull. Catches. Is the door self-closing and self-latching? Are you going to put in magnetic catches, bullet catches? What sort of catch are you going to put on? Does it need some sort of bolt on the inside if it's a set of square doors? Does it have to lock? What type of lock are you going to use? Where are you going to put the lock? Are you going to put an escutcheon plate on? What type of escutcheon plate? How do you handle a set of paired doors? Do you want both of them to lock? Do you put a center style and make them both lock into that same center style? And if it's a drop-down door like in a desk, do you put a stay, or do you put the, what do you call these sliders that pull out? There's a very special name for them. Or do you put a pair of sliders? Now, I'm not going to say anything more about the choice of hardware. But what I say to you this evening is make those decisions before you start cutting wood and making joints to make a door. And the other thing I want to say to you is don't spoil a nice door and a nice cabinet with cheap hardware. And I see Lionel agreeing with me 100%. Think about the assembly. Frame and panel door, the whole idea behind a frame and panel door is that the panel can subsequently expand and contract. If you put it together in the wet season and then finish the entire door, come the dry season, the panel's going to contract, and guess what you're going to see? You're going to see two unfinished lines down the side. So think about how you're going to finish and the approach you're going to finish. But I maintain a frame and panel door the panel must be pre-finished, as I show here. Do a dry run, and this is true of not only doors, it's true of any assembly. Make sure it's flat and square, because once that glue is dried, there's nothing you can do if it's not flat and square. And to try and subsequently fit a door to a cabinet, to try and fit a door which is not flat and square, that's a lot of PT. So do the simple things like putting a straight edge over it, adjust the position of the clamps if necessary to tweak it a little bit, check the diagonals with the tape. But the most important way of assuring that doors put up flat and square is making sure the timber you start with is flat and square. And it's worth the additional effort. It's worth checking with a good square that the fence on your jointer is accurate. Because if your frames are 90 degrees face to edge and your rails are cut off at 90 degrees, especially if you're using loose tenons, I guarantee you put a clamp across that, they will only pull up flat. So that additional effort in the beginning pays off not only with doors, it pays off with any woodworking. Right, so here are some pictures which I took out of an American catalog. The top row are flat recessed panels. Now, here's an interesting one. It's that same door, but with a central mountain. And you know, the same way that they tell ladies you must look at which way the stripes run on your dress, mountains or intermediate rails have exactly the same effect on a door. It either makes the door look taller and narrower, or it makes the door look shorter and wider. The bottom row are some variations of a raised panel and a simple raised panel, 3 raised panels set within a door. It's a little more work, but that can look very, very effective. The so-called cathedral arch, there are a number of different ways of taking this basic design of a frame and panel and ending up with the door. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that those 5 doors, every one looks different to the other, and a finished cupboard with any of those doors would look different to any other cupboard with those doors. Okay, let's go into some detail now, and we'll see how much we can get through. The rail styles are my choice of rail. I say preferably quarter sawn. Quarter sawn is the stuff which is most stable. It's the stuff which expands and contracts the least. And I believe that a door should have, that the emphasis, the focus of the door should be the panel, not the stuff that's around the panel. So if you take quarter sawn, straight grain, because quarter sawn by definition gives you nice straight parallel grain material, use that for the rails and stiles. It's stable and it's a subdued figure and allows you to emphasize your panel. Now, I have realized in recent years that perhaps the biggest mistake that woodworkers make is they do not give enough attention to how you match and use different pieces of wood. I believe that if you've got a pile of wood and there's a project, that out of that pile of wood, each piece of wood is best fitted to one of the components in that project. And it's worth spending a little bit of time up front deciding how you're going to use the wood which is available to you. And before I make a set of doors, I go through the wood and I move it around and I try and find the straight grain stuff for the rails and stiles and the fancier stuff for the panels. Now, having said that, don't become a slave to it, because if you become a slave to that, you'll end up buying 3 times the amount of wood you need. On the other hand, be sympathetic to the wood. Avoid sloping grain. This is a little bedside pedestal I made. It wasn't made as a bedside pedestal. It was made as a prototype for a series of joints and construction techniques for that large wall unit I had a photograph of earlier. And only afterwards I realized, well, look at this piece of wood. That slopes off at about, the grain slopes off at about, I don't know, what's that, almost 15 degrees. This slopes off, and that slopes off. And you look at that door, and although it's dead square, it looks cockeyed. It looks cockeyed. And the sloping grain results from a tree trunk which bent or the way it was cut. Take a bit of time and use a little bit of extra wood. And what I do today is I cut a shape of the rail or the stile I want inside a piece of paper, and I just jiggle a bit. And sometimes I'll go and cut off at an angle of my bandsaw, waste a bit of wood, but avoid this, which when I look at that today, I'm ashamed to admit that I made that piece of furniture even as a prototype. And I don't know how well you can see this. Bill, you recognize this, the trophy cabineted Muriel Brand School. What's this? Zebra wood. What's it called?
Partridge wood.
Partridge wood. That style is flat sawn. That style is quarter sawn. That style is flat sawn. That style is quarter sawn, and that style is flat sawn. And it offends my eye immediately. If all you've got is flat sawn, well then make it all out of flat sawn, but don't mix the pieces of wood at random like this. Let's talk about joints. I want to just very quickly, mortise and tenon or loose tenon is undoubtedly the strongest joint. The stub tenon, which comes from stick and cope, I'll talk about it a little more. I have some problems with the stub tenon and the stick and cope joint. Biscuits, dowels, and then the question of, do you make it 90 degrees or do you make it 45 degrees? And I think, talking about mortises, you don't have to have an expensive machine to cut mortises. And this is another one of my jigs many of you have seen, and it's also written up in the Home Handy magazine. But if you don't have a router, Lionel makes a very simple doweling jig which does an excellent job of taking a stile, a top rail, a middle rail, and a bottom rail, and putting them together to make doors. So Lionel and I have an agreement. Any jigs that's bought from him this evening, I'm going to get 10%.
You'll be lucky.
Let's talk about putting a mitre joint on the corner of the door between the rail and the stile. There are two advantages to using a mitre joint, and there's one major disadvantage to using a mitre joint when making up a door. What are the advantages of using a mitre joint? No edge grain. That's the first and most obvious example. No edge grain. Okay? Except tiniest of points at the end, but if it's well made, you don't miss it. No edge grain. What's the other major advantage of using a mitre joint? A big area to glue, a big area of end grain that soaks up the glue and doesn't glue at all. A mitre is essentially a very weak joint. The other major disadvantage of a mitred door, the other major advantage of a mitred joint is that you have to give no special handling to the moulding on the inside edge. You can have the most complex moulding. You can have the most complex moulding, and if you cut the mitre well, those two pieces come together and the moulding comes together. That's the major advantage of a mitre, is that you have to give no special attention to the moulding on the edge. But there is a serious disadvantage. There's a serious disadvantage to making a mitred door. What is that? Well, a mitre joint is essentially a very simple joint, but presents some problems, as John Withers told us in his presentation on the grandfather's clock. But I'm assuming that you can make a decent mitre. Eh? What is the major disadvantage of a mitre door? Well, that's a disadvantage we can overcome. The disadvantage of a mitred door is having assembled that door, you cannot trim it. If it doesn't fit, you cannot trim it. Think of a mitre, coming together at a sharp corner. If that door's 2 millimeters too wide, can you go over your joiner and take 2 millimeters off the side? No way. You suddenly chop off the corner of the mitre. The only way, and Hilton is quite correct, the only way you can trim a mitre door is by trimming all four sides by an equal amount. And that is a serious shortcoming of a mitred door, because fitting doors to carcasses requires a little bit of tweaking, no matter how accurate you look. And the mitre is a problem. And if I make a mitred door, and there are good reasons to making a mitred door, I make the door first, and then build the cabinet to fit. And that sounds stupid, and I see somebody laughing, and let me tell you, that's the best piece of advice I'm giving to you this evening. And yes, a mitred joint is a weak joint, and don't think because it's 1 point the square root of 2 longer than a normal butt joint, don't think it's any stronger, because it's essentially end grain. A mitred joint has to be strengthened. Biscuits are a solution, and I would put 2 biscuits in a mitre. Going to a smaller biscuit if necessary, a number 10 or even a number 0 biscuit. A very elegant solution is the mitred halving, which is a very strong joint. A very strong joint because it has a large surface area. Okay, enough about the joints. So I'm not giving you all the answers, but I'm giving you the questions you must ask yourselves and some of the answers. The outer edge, moulding the outer edge, and there are 2 examples here, one with a cove and one with a round over. No special technique. Make up the door, trim the door, and then run the 4 sides around the router in the correct, in the correct sequence. So putting a moulding on the outside edge of the door is, it's like falling off a lot. Putting a moulding on the inside of the door is a different problem. If you've used, well, solution is no moulding. And I've seen some very, very attractive doors that have no moulding whatsoever on the inside edge of the frames and styles. And George Struble has a TV cabinet made before he had a cope and stick cutter with George. Those edges are flat, 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 and those doors and panels look very good. So don't believe that you have to mould the inside edge. A minor joint, anything goes. A stock chamfer, not bevel, stock chamfer, either a 45-degree chamfer or a cove can look very good. You can dry assemble the door before you put the panel in and run your router around it. And if you're as handy with a carving chisel as Bull Parrot is, you can in fact even carve that out into what's called a mason's mitre. And Bull's starting to give carving lessons. And he's also in his 10%. Cope and stick. Cope and stick is the joint technique most often used for commercially produced frame and panel doors. It consists of either a pair of matched cutters or cutters which you alter the sequence, or cutters which are stacked one on top of the other, but the net effect is that the one cut makes this cut on the style, which is called the stick cut, and the other cutter, or the reassembled cutter, makes the cut on the edge of the rail, which is called the cope cut. And at the same time, that cutter cuts the panel groove, and the theory is you just put the cut in the router and run all the styles past it, and move the cutter up or change the cutter and run the edges of the rails past it. This type of joint relies on that stub tenon there to hold that joint together. That's all it is. It's a stub tenon, typically no more than 12 millimeters deep, a very small surface gluing area. And if I make a door with cope and stick cutters, for myself, I don't put a floating tenon in that joint. And I know that will last forever.
How strong are those joints? They're obviously not.
That stub tenon does not present a very large face grain gluing area and is not all that strong. With modern adhesives, you get away with it. I don't. If I make a door for myself, I cut 2 mortises with a stub tenon and then I machine on the router.
Because even the ordinary house door, they make like that with this.
Even an ordinary house door they make like that, and I will show you plenty of photographs of house doors which are sagged and the joints have pulled apart. It's not, this cope and stick is not the strongest of joints. There are many designs available. Here's a combined bead and cove. Here is a simple 45-degree ledge. There are many designs available, but they're very expensive. And I guess today, if you're looking for a cope and stick pair of router cutters, it'll cost you $1,000 rand. Okay, enough about frames. Let's talk about panels and bolts. Just tell me how I'm doing time-wise. Fine. What does that mean? We've got 5 minutes. Let's talk about panels. Plywood's fine. 3mm plywood's too thin. And you can just tap it and you can hear it's only 3mm plywood. So I normally take 2 pieces of plywood and glue them back to back. So I glue the bad face to the bad face, and not only does that give me a panel which is more stable, it also gives me a good face on the inside of the door. And I'm an old-fashioned cabinet maker. I believe the inside of the door should look as good as the outside of the door. Laminate 2 pieces back to back, or in fact even on bigger doors I've gone as far as sticking a bit of cheaper ply between them and laminating up a 9mm panel. Now, Plywood is very stable. The very nature of plywood, its construction of alternating plies and alternating grain directions is very stable. And in fact, a plywood panel, you can actually put a spot of glue on and glue it into the frames. This is a photo from somebody's study I did out for them. And tell me what's wrong with those two plywood doors? Those two plywood panel doors. What's wrong with them? What's wrong with them? No, they're both down. They're both down. Now you can't even see the grain in the style, so don't talk. Sorry, somebody was saying something.
Your backing on the other side is not the same way.
Taste. Turn the grain around to face up. And in fact, I found it very interesting going back through some of these photographs of my earlier work, and I suddenly realized mistakes at the time. And I say to you as an aside, take photographs of your work, take photographs of work in progress, and go back. It's amazing how much you learn.
A question, Dennis.
Yes, Doc.
Surely, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If
Beauty
you're
is-
happy with it that way, do it that way.
If you're happy with it that way, do it that way. Don't ever do one up and one down.
No.
Which is what annoys the hell out of me. If you buy a set of
won't do
doors
it.
from Tipton, they'll drill them without any consideration of which way the grain is running. Don, you're right. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and part of the message I'm hoping to get across this evening is do not turn out doors where everyone looks the same as everybody else's door, because there are so many variations you can achieve with the fundamental construction. Theoretically, you're right, Don disagrees with us, but the theory is that these so-called cathedrals, these V-shaped, these U-shaped things should point upwards. That's why they're called cathedrals, and the reason is that they lead your eye upwards to the crown molding, which is the glory of a cabinet. If I remade this today, I would do the panels the other way around. Plywood panels are very stable, as I've said, and plywood panels lend themselves to some interesting applied overlays. This is not a fancy door with muntins and internal rails with joints. These are simply plopped on. They are applied onto the plywood. And you can do some very, very interesting things by putting additional rails, muntins, and variations thereon, sticking it on top of a plywood panel. You can only do it on a plywood panel. You can't do it on a solid wood panel, because you have now contention between horizontal and vertical grain, and they're sure to pull off. I say save the showy panels, usually the flat sawn panels, save the showy boards for the panel, so that the focus is on the panel. Now, if this can be done, I'm not saying you must go out and buy 3 times the amount of wood to make sure you can do it, but if this is achievable, do just that. Spend a lot of time edge matching the boards. Typically, these panels, you're not going to get panels which are wide enough today. You're going to have to edge glue them. Spend the time and play. Play musical chairs, if I could use that, with the panels, and spend a lot of time and get what to you is the best edge matching. Now, it can't be perfect, but there are some which stick out like a sore thumb. These panels, and unfortunately they don't come out, I in fact resawed from 38mm Oregon, and I book matched them. And when you go to that sort of trouble, when you have some nice highly figured wood, and you resaw it and book match, I would go one step further. We'll come to it later. Panels can be flat or raised and fielded. And this is the point I was to make. If you've got some nice, highly figured wood for the panel, don't go panel raise it, don't go put molding on the inside edge of the door. You in fact detract from the beauty of that simple panel. And Don will argue with me, because as Don correctly says, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Raised panels can do it on a spindle. And here's an example of a door made by Vesey. Were you Vesey? Made over the weekend on a spindle. So the raised panel, the stick cut, and the coat cut to make up a raised panel door. So, you know, the spindle is if you've got a spindle, these doors are a cinch to make. You can do it on a router. You have to. A spindle, they can be used on a router table. For a router table, you get both vertical panel raising bits, where you in fact have to hold the panel up on edge, but it's not as heavy a chunk of metal spinning around or horizontal bit. But you don't even have to have a router or a spindle. And the panels on John Withers' grandfather clock, which could have equally well been panels inside a frame and panel door, John, you cut them on his table saw. So you don't have to have a lot of fancy equipment to make a frame and panel door with a raised panel. Right, the elements of a frame and panel door. We've seen there are a number of elements: the rail, the style, the size of the rails, the width of the rails, the inner edging, the outer edging, the panel, whether it's flat, whether it's raised, whether you have additional rails, whether you have intermediate buttons. In fact, they are without limit, and the aesthetic possibilities of good-looking cabinet doors is almost infinite. I'm nothing against a door like this, but you know, don't make every door in your house and every cabinet you make with that type of door. Think of doing a little carving on the panel, something to personalize. Think of a router with a veining cutter and perhaps a sheaf of wheat or something in the bottom corner of the panel. Put an inlay of a contrasting material. Make it a contrasting wood. Use and play with different molds. Play with different materials. Just quickly, a warning: when you glue up panels into a frame and panel door, make sure you don't have glue squeeze out. Because if you have squeeze out and the corner of the panel is trapped, in the dry season that door is going to split. Inevitably that has going to split, and I've seen enough split doors to stand up and say this with some measure of authority. It splits at the weakest point. Glass panels. Just very quickly, a few words about glass panels. You know, glass comes in all styles: sandblasted, etched, coloured, and a glass door can relieve. Well, a glass door can if it's clear, provide you a view of what's inside, like that trophy cabinet we saw earlier. A glass door can relieve solid door after solid door after solid door. And a kitchen without some glass doors in it, to me, is just too much solid panel. How do you fit that glass? You can do it with plastic clips, to which I say yep. Plastic clips are banned from my workshop. We've been through this before. I use glazing bars. We ran a little competition on how to do glazing bars, and I think there's only one way to fit glass and other panel material other than solid panel. Now, a problem that I've come across since I spoke to you about glazing bars, and I thought I'd just include this evening before I finish, is what happens if the glass breaks. You know, if you have a patio sliding door which is held by glazing bars and the glass breaks, you put your putty knife, or if it's the guy with the doors, you just put a blunt screwdriver in it, and you can prise that and spring that glazing bar away, pull it out, and then once you've got one glazing bar out, the other three are very easy to take out. But if you have a small door, you cannot spring that glazing bar sufficient to get it out and the other three out. And short of breaking one of the glazing bars, there's not much you can do. Cool. And I've been making doors for years, and I could kick myself when I came across the solution in one of the magazines. Because on small doors, cut one of the glazing bars in half. Cut one of the glazing bars in half, and then install half, and then the other half. And if they're the same piece of glazing bar, one if you cut in half, you cannot see the joint in the middle. But if that glass breaks, you can prise the half out, and the other three come out very quickly. Peter tells me I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to talk very quickly about hinging, a large variety. Many hinges are cheap and nasty. They are really cheap and nasty. I stick to mainly 3 types. The Euro hinge, or the cup or pot hinge, the cabinet hinge and the butt hinge, and just a few comments about this and then I'm through. The Euro hinge is wonderful. It provides you with a 3-way adjustment. Up and down, this way and that way, but don't let this be an excuse for poor joinery. It's invisible when the door is closed, and that's an advantage. It's intrusive and ugly when the door is open. It's definitely intrusive. And in fact, if you want to have some sort of sliding show, there's spaces on it to bypass these things. But there's a lot of scope for using these hinges, and as I say, they are reasonably easy to fit. They're available in full overlay, half overlay, no overlay. They're self-closing, so you don't have to worry about any form of catch, and you can get them for a variety of special situations. 180-degree opening, 270-degree opening, 45-degree corner cabinets. The cabinet hinge is used with overlay doors. It's a very simple hinge, where the one part folds back into the other. It provides a 2-way adjustment, as you can see here and here. It doesn't provide the 3rd way of adjustment, but typically you don't need that. And when it's closed, it's fairly unobtrusive. So I've done a lot of cabinets with this type of hinge. But in the final analysis, there's nothing to beat a butt hinge. Butt hinge is the traditionally used with inset doors. It's totally non-intrusive, and nothing beats a solid brass hinge. And if you're going to make nice doors for a nice cabinet, buy solid brass hinges.
Just the cost.
Skill is required to fit a solid brass hinge. In fact, optimally, you should cut mortars for each leaf. One in the cabinet frame and one in the door frame. A lot of people take these way out and cut a double depth mortise in one of the 2 pieces. It's very difficult to adjust. In fact, the only way you end up adjusting is by taking it out, plugging the holes, the screw holes, re-drilling them, and starting again, or cutting pieces of cardboard, shim, and fitting it up. So I won't try and bluff you that fitting solid brass butt hinges is an easy job, but it's a worthwhile job, because the final result is magic. At least I think it's magic. And if cutting a rebate or a mortise for each leaf, for each hinge puts you off, I wrote an article for the September issue of the Home Handyman, and I'm glad to see you here, Mr. Terry. Terry, how do those hinge jigs work? Magic, there you are. And I'll give you 10%. Okay, that's me for the evening. As I said, I cannot give you all the answers in 3/4 of an hour. I hope I've given you most of the questions that you should ask yourself. And I finish this presentation as I finish most of my presentations. Do you need to make some doors? Seriously, do you need to make some doors? Come, give me a call, let's get together, and let's go through some of the questions I haven't answered this evening. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I hand back to you.